Before we begin, if you find yourself wandering the dimly lit corridors of sleepless nights, consider subscribing to Nightfall Notions. Here, boredom is a virtue, and the stories are just strange enough to keep you company until dawn. Now, let us drift into the first chapter of a tale best told in the quiet hours, when the mind is prone to wandering into the peculiar and the unsettling. Chapter 1. The Pharaoh's Invitation. The desert stretched endlessly beneath a sky so vast it seemed to press down upon the earth with the weight of eternity. Amasis, a traveler of no particular renown but considerable weariness, trudged through the dunes with the resigned determination of a man who had long since forgotten why he had begun his journey in the first place. His sandals were worn thin, his water skin nearly empty, and his thoughts had dwindled to a single persistent refrain: "I would sell my shadow for a place to rest." It was then, as if summoned by his exhaustion, that the palace emerged from the rippling heat haze. At first, Amasis assumed it was a mirage, a cruel trick of the sun and his own desperate mind. But no, there it stood, impossibly grand, its golden domes catching the light like promises whispered to the wind. The gates, towering and inlaid with lapis lazuli, swung open without a sound, revealing a courtyard where fountains murmured secrets to the air. A figure awaited him, draped in linen so fine it seemed woven from moonlight. The Pharaoh, for it could be no one else, regarded Amasis with eyes that held the patience of centuries. His smile was slow, deliberate, the kind of expression one wears when savoring a joke no one else has heard yet. "You look weary, traveler," the Pharaoh said, his voice smooth as oil over stone. "Come, you shall dine at my table and rest your head where kings have dreamed." Amasis, who had never so much as shared a meal with a village elder, hesitated. Generosity from the powerful was seldom what it seemed. But the ache in his bones outweighed his caution, and so he bowed, murmuring thanks as he followed the Pharaoh into the cool, shadowed halls. The feast was a spectacle of excess. Platters of figs glistened like jewels, roasted meats dripped with sauces fragrant enough to make a man weep, and wine flowed in rivers so dark they might have been poured from the night itself. Amasis ate until his stomach ached, drank until the edges of the room softened, and listened as the Pharaoh spoke of empires and gods in the same breath. When at last the torches burned low, the Pharaoh clapped his hands, and the servant approached bearing a pillow. Not just any pillow. This one was a work of art, its linen casing embroidered with threads of gold, its filling so plush it seemed to sigh as it was set upon the divan. "For you," the Pharaoh said, gesturing grandly. "A gift, so that your sleep may be as undisturbed as the depths of the tomb." Amasis, now drowsy with food and wine, accepted without question. He lay back, the pillow cradling his head like a lover's hands, and for the first time in months he felt true comfort. The last thing he saw before his eyes closed was the Pharaoh's smile, lingering in the dim light like the edge of a blade. Sleep came swiftly, but it was not the restful slumber he had hoped for. Amasis dreamed of corridors. Endless, winding corridors, their walls lined with hieroglyphs that shifted when he tried to read them. The air was thick with the scent of incense, and something older, something like damp earth and forgotten words. Footsteps echoed somewhere ahead, always just out of sight. He called out, but his voice was swallowed by the darkness. Then a whisper, so close it might have been his own thoughts. "You should not have taken what was not yours." Yes, Bandati. Kaideni. He woke with a start, his heart pounding as if he had run for miles. The pillow beneath his head was warm. Too warm. And as Amasis sat up, his fingers brushed against something that made his blood turn to ice. A heartbeat, slow and steady, pulsing beneath the embroidered fabric. The Pharaoh's laughter, distant and delighted, drifted through the halls. And somewhere beneath the palace, deep in the dark where even time hesitated to tread, something stirred. Chapter 2. The Cursed Linen. Amasis sat bolt upright, his fingers recoiling from the pillow, as though it had bitten him. The steady, rhythmic pulse beneath the fabric was unmistakable. He pressed a hand to his own chest, half expecting to find his own heartbeat gone, stolen away into the cursed thing beneath him. But no, his heart still pounded, a frantic drumbeat of fear. The chamber was dim, the last of the torches guttering in their sconces, casting long wavering shadows that seemed to lean in closer, watching. The Pharaoh was nowhere to be seen, but the echo of his laughter lingered, clinging to the air like the scent of myrrh. Amasis swallowed hard and forced himself to look at the pillow. It was still beautiful, still impossibly soft, but now he saw what he had missed before. The stitching along the edges was too precise, the golden threads too bright, as if they had been woven not by human hands, but by something that had never known daylight. And the linen, closer now, he could see faint, ghostly stains, barely visible unless the light caught them just so. Stains that looked disturbingly like the imprints of fingers. He had heard stories, of course. Every traveler had. The dead in this land were never truly gone, and the things they left behind, bandages, amulets, the very cloth they were wrapped in, held echoes of their final moments. But to weave such things into a pillow, that was a cruelty even the gods might balk at. A whisper brushed against his ear, so faint he might have imagined it. Who sleeps in my place? And they silly pick out in his digging to drown. Amasis jerked away, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. He needed to get out. And then, now. He stood, his legs unsteady beneath him, and took a step toward the chamber's entrance. Then, another. The floor was cold beneath his feet, the silence so thick it pressed against his skin. He had nearly reached the doorway when the pillow moved. Not much. Just a slight shift, as if something beneath the fabric had turned over in its sleep. Amasis froze. A slow, creaking sigh filled the room, the sound of ancient linen stretching over something that had no right to still be breathing. Then from behind him, a voice, dry, cracked, the sound of papyrus crumbling to dust. "You have taken my rest. Now I must take yours. See, I know the going to note, God Swiss free. Shall I? Amasis did not wait to hear more. He ran. The halls of the palace blurred around him, the once glorious murals now seeming to twist and leer as he passed. He did not know where he was going, only that he had to escape, had to put as much distance between himself and that room as possible. A hand caught his arm. Amasis nearly screamed before he realized it was a servant, a young man with eyes so wide they looked ready to spill from his skull. "You must leave," the servant hissed, his grip tightening, "before he notices you are gone." "Who?" Amasis gasped, though he already knew the answer. The servant's gaze flickered toward the shadows. "The one who does not sleep. The one who collects rest like others collect gold." He thrust a small, wrinkled scrap of fabric into Amasis' hand. "Take this, burn it when you are far from here, and never, ever look back." Before Amasis could ask another question, the servant vanished into the dark, leaving him alone with the weight of the linen in his palm. It was then that he heard it, the unmistakable sound of something heavy being dragged across stone, coming closer. Amasis ran faster. The gates of the palace loomed ahead, still open, as if the Pharaoh had known all along he would try to flee. Amasis burst through them, the desert air hitting him like a slap. He did not stop. Not when his lungs burned, not when the sand bit into his bare feet. He ran until the palace was nothing but a shimmer on the horizon, until the only sound was his own ragged breathing. Only then did he dare to look at the scrap in his hand. It was a piece of the same linen, frayed, stained, and, he realized with a jolt, still faintly warm. From far away, carried on the wind, came the faintest whisper. "You cannot outrun a cursed traveler. Amasis clenched his fist around the fabric. He had no intention of trying. He would burn it, just as the servant had said. But first, he had to survive the night, and the thing that was coming for him. Chapter 3. Dreams of the Nile. The desert night was cold, but Amasis did not dare light a fire. The scrap of cursed linen still burned in his palm like a brand, though he had yet to find the courage to destroy it. Somewhere in the darkness, something was watching. He could feel it in the prickle at the back of his neck, in the way the wind carried whispers that were not quite words. Exhaustion, heavier than the weight of the Pharaoh's hospitality, dragged at his eyelids. He fought it as long as he could, but even fear could only keep a man awake for so long. When sleep finally took him, it did not come gently. Amasis dreamed of the Nile. Not the life-giving river he had heard sung of in taverns and market squares, but something older, darker. The waters rose not with the fertile black silt of the inundation, but with something thick and sluggish, like tar. The air stank of rotting reeds and something far worse beneath, the acrid tang of decay, of bodies left too long in the sun. The dream carried him forward, helpless as a leaf on the current. The river banks were lined with figures, their silhouettes blurred as though seen through heat haze. They did not move. They did not speak. But their heads turned as one as Amasis drifted past, their empty eyes tracking his progress with a hunger that made his stomach twist. Then the river widened, opening into a vast, black expanse where the water met the sky in an unbroken line of nothingness. A boat waited there, its prow carved into the shape of a serpent with eyes of dull amber. At its helm stood a figure wrapped in shadows, their face hidden beneath a hood of frayed linen. "You are late," the figure said, their voice the sound of dry papyrus crumbling to dust. Amasis tried to speak, to protest that he had never meant to come here at all, but his tongue stuck to the roof of his mouth like a thing desiccated. The figure extended a hand, the fingers unnaturally long, the nails cracked and yellowed. The price must be paid. Behind them, the waters stirred. Shapes broke the surface. Not fish, not crocodiles, but things with too many limbs, their forms shifting like ink spilled in water. They reached for the boat with grasping, skeletal hands. Amasis stumbled back, his heel catching on the edge of the dream itself. The river, the boat, the watching figures, all of it wavered like a reflection disturbed. The hooded figure tilted its head. "You cannot wake," it said, almost gently. "Not while you carry what is ours." Amasis looked down. The scrap of linen was no longer in his hand. It was wrapped around his wrist, the edges fraying into his skin like roots seeking purchase. He woke with a gasp so sharp it tasted of blood. Dawn had not yet broken. The desert was silent, the stars overhead cold and indifferent. His body ached as though he had run for miles, and his wrist bore a thin red line where the linen had been. Amasis scrambled to his feet, the dream still clinging to him like a second skin. He needed to burn the cursed thing now, before sleep could take him again. But as he reached into the pouch where he had tucked the scrap away, his fingers found nothing but fine, black ash. From the east, the first light of morning crept across the dunes, and with it came a sound, so faint he might have imagined it, the distant, rhythmic lapping of water against unseen shores. Chapter 4. The Hieroglyphic Warning. The desert morning brought no comfort. Though the sun rose blazing over the dunes, Amasis felt no warmth, only the lingering chill of the dream that clung to him like a second shadow. His wrist still burned where the linen had left its mark, a thin red line that pulsed faintly as if something beneath his skin had taken root and now stirred with restless impatience. He walked without direction, his feet dragging through the sand. The palace was far behind him now, though he could not shake the feeling that its golden halls still watched from some unseen vantage. Hunger gnawed at his stomach, and thirst made his tongue stick to the roof of his mouth. But worse than these was the exhaustion that pulled at his bones, heavy and insistent. He had not truly slept, not since the Pharaoh's pillow. By midday he stumbled upon the ruins of a forgotten shrine. Little remained but a few crumbling pillars and the broken face of some long-forsaken god, staring blankly at the sky. It was not shelter, but the shade it offered was better than nothing. Amasis collapsed against the stones, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He had meant only to rest his eyes for a moment. But the moment his head tilted back against the ancient stone, the whispers began. At first they were nothing more than the rustling of sand against rock. Then, slowly, they resolved into words. Soft, insistent, murmured in a language that should have been dead for centuries. Amasis tried to push himself upright, to shake off the creeping dread that slithered down his spine, but his limbs would not obey. His eyelids grew heavier, the world around him dimming as though the sun itself had been smothered. And then he saw it. The pillow. Not the cursed gift from the Pharaoh, but something far older, its golden embroidery tarnished black, its linen yellowed with age. It lay nestled among the ruins as if it had been waiting for him. The whispers grew louder, hissing like sand through an hourglass, urging him closer. Amasis knew he should run. Every instinct screamed at him to turn away, to flee before whatever slept within that fabric took notice of him. But his body no longer belonged to him. His legs moved without his consent, carrying him toward the pillow with the inevitability of a man walking to his own execution. When he was close enough to touch it, he saw the hieroglyphs. They curled along the edge of the linen, so small and faded they might have been mistaken for mere stitching, if not for the way they seemed to shift under his gaze, rearranging themselves into words he should not have been able to read, yet understood all the same. Rest here, but never wake. The moment he comprehended the warning, the whispers ceased. The desert held its breath. Even the wind stilled, as if the world itself waited to see what he would do. Amasis reached out. His fingers brushed the linen, and the ruins vanished. He stood now in a chamber deep beneath the earth, the walls lined with painted faces whose eyes followed his every move. The air was thick with the scent of embalming spices and something older, something like the inside of a freshly opened tomb. Before him stood a bier, and upon it lay a figure wrapped in bandages so tightly they might have been a second skin. The figure sat up. The bandages did not loosen. They strained against the movement, the fabric creaking like old parchment. Yet still the figure rose, its face a blank expanse of yellowed linen where no eyes should have been, yet somehow watching him all the same. Should not have read the words, it said, its voice the sound of a burial shroud unraveling in the dark. Amasis tried to step back, but the chamber had no exit. The walls pressed closer, the painted faces grinning now, their teeth too sharp, their smiles too wide. The bandaged figure reached for him, its fingers brushing his forehead, and Amasis woke screaming. He was back in the ruins, the sun now low in the sky. His throat was raw, his body drenched in sweat, and in his hand was a single thread of gold, plucked from the pillow's edge. The pillow itself was gone, but the whispers remained, and they were laughing. Chapter 5. The Servant's Tale. The thread of gold burned against Amasis's palm like a brand. He should have cast it away, let the desert winds take it where they would. But something stayed his hand, some instinct that whispered this thread was more than it seemed, that it might yet be the key to unraveling the curse tightening around him like a burial shroud. Night fell swiftly, and with it came the cold. Amasis had no fire, no shelter beyond the meager lee of a crumbling dune. The stars offered no comfort, their distant light only serving to deepen the shadows between them. He was not alone. He had known that since the moment he fled the palace, but now the presence that dogged his steps felt closer, more deliberate. The whispers had grown louder, forming words that skittered just beyond understanding. A sound broke the silence, soft, hesitant footsteps approaching through the dark. Amasis tensed, fingers closing around the golden thread as if it might serve as some pitiful weapon. "Peace, traveler," came a voice from the gloom. "I mean you no harm." A figure emerged from the shadows, cloaked in tattered linen, their face obscured by the hood. But Amasis recognized the voice. It was the same servant who had warned him to flee the palace. "You," Amasis breathed, his voice raw. "Why have you followed me?" The servant lowered their hood, revealing a face too young for the weariness in their eyes. "Because you carry the thread," they said. "And because you are still alive. That makes you rare." Amasis glanced down at the glint of gold in his palm. "What do you know of this?" The servant settled beside him in the sand, their movements stiff, as if every joint ached. "More than I wish to. You are not the first to be offered the Pharaoh's pillow." A gust of wind hissed across the dunes, carrying with it the scent of dry earth and something faintly metallic. The servant continued, their voice low. "There was a merchant from the north, proud and rich. He boasted that no luxury in the world could surprise him. The Pharaoh gave him a pillow stuffed with nightingale feathers. The man laughed as he lay down upon it. By dawn his body was gone. Only his smile remained, carved into the linen." Amasis's throat tightened. "A scholar came next," a servant said. "A man who sought the secrets of the dead. The Pharaoh gifted him a pillow embroidered with the names of forgotten gods." The scholar spent the whole night murmuring along with the stitches. When the sun rose, his lips were still moving, though his breath had long since stopped. The servant paused, their gaze drifting to the horizon where the palace stood unseen. Then there was a girl, a dancer with hands like fluttering birds. The Pharaoh gave her a pillow filled with lotus petals. She sighed as she laid her head upon it, as if she had found the softest bed in the world. In the morning her body was as light as if the bones had vanished from her flesh. They buried her in a child's coffin. A silence stretched between them, broken only by the shifting of sand. Amasis swallowed. And none of them realized. None tried to escape. The servant's smile was bitter. Oh, they realized, too late. The pillows do not let go so easily. They reached out, tracing a finger along the red mark, circling Amasis's wrist. "You at least have lasted longer than most, perhaps because you have not yet slept upon it willingly." Amasis jerked his hand away. "I have no intention of sleeping upon it at all." The servant's gaze flickered to the golden thread. "That is not yours to decide. The thread binds you now. It will find its way back to the rest, stitch by stitch, and when it does—" A gust of wind snatched the words away, but Amasis did not need to hear them to know their meaning. Somewhere in the distance, a jackal howled. The servant stood, their cloaks stirring like a shroud in the wind. "Dawn approaches. I must return before I am missed." Amasis caught their arm. "Wait, you serve the Pharaoh. Why warn me?" The servant did not pull away. For a moment their face softened, revealing something far younger and far more frightened beneath. Because I was the first," they whispered, "and my pillow still waits for me in the palace, growing emptier with every soul it takes." Before Amasis could speak, the servant wrenched free and vanished into the dark, leaving Amasis alone with the thread, the whispers, and the growing certainty that the next time he closed his eyes, he would not wake again. The wind carried a new sound now, faint, rhythmic, unmistakable, the sound of a needle pulling through cloth. Chapter 6. The sand in the seams. The golden thread had begun to move. Amasis discovered this at dawn when he uncurled his stiff fingers to find the delicate strand no longer lay coiled in his palm, but had instead wound itself around his index finger, like a serpent claiming its perch. He tried to shake it loose, but the thread only tightened its grip, the end fraying into fine filaments that burrowed under his fingernail. The pain was sharp and sudden, like the sting of a scorpion's tail. He barely had time to register the blood welling around the embedded fibers, before the whispers erupted into full voices. Not just one or two, but dozens. layered atop one another in a dissonant chorus. You should not have taken what was not yours. Us. Sand comes for all of us in the end. It seemed for an Adamai. Lay down, traveler, then didn't we? Lay down and let us sing you to sleep. Benifinionsely. Best of my bed. It had pebble for me. Amasis clapped his hands over his ears, but the voices were not in the air. They slithered up from beneath his skin, vibrating through the bones of his wrists where the linen had marked him. His vision swam, the desert blurring into streaks of gold and black as the voices grew louder, more insistent. Then, abruptly, they stopped. The silence was almost worse. Amasis lowered his hands and found himself standing at the edge of an unfamiliar wadi, its dry bed dotted with shards of pottery and the bleached bones of some long-dead beast. And there, nestled between two stones as if placed with care, was the pillow. Not the grand, embroidered thing from the Pharaoh's palace, nor the tattered relic from the ruins. This one was different, smaller, plainer, its linen yellowed with age and fraying at the seams. As Amasis watched, a single grain of sand trickled from a loose stitch. Then another. Then a slow, steady stream. But this was no ordinary sand. The grains were black as obsidian, each one glistening faintly, as if wet with something thicker than water. And as they fell, they did not scatter soundlessly across the ground. They hummed. A low, mournful chant rose from the growing pile. The voices of countless souls packed tight as seeds within a pomegranate. The sound resonated in Amasis' teeth, in the hollows of his ribs, in the pulse at his wrists where the curse had taken root. He should have run. Every instinct screamed at him to turn away, to leave this place before whatever slept inside that pillow took notice of him. But his feet carried him forward, step by unwilling step, until he stood close enough to see the fine stitching along the pillow's edge. Not gold thread now, but something darker, something that might have been hair. The sand poured faster, the chant swelling into words. We were kings once. Shornai, Anubis untase, Anan, Lesnika breakthrough, Honda, and they were priests. Neo, the lilies. We were mothers, and thieves, and children who laughed in the sun. Aris, then, the guardian of the Sosagade, the really universaliums were shante. No, we are sand. Esepandise. Enough, we are seams. Esiadedanteshi. Amasis reached out, his fingers trembling. He did not want to touch the pillow, but something in the voices called to him, not with malice, but with a terrible, aching loneliness. His fingertip brushed the linen. The world tore open. He was no longer in the wadi. He stood instead in a vast, darkened hall, its ceiling lost in shadow, its walls lined with countless pillows of every size and shape. Some were pristine, their embroidery gleaming. Others were little more than tattered scraps, leaking black sand onto the floor. And at the center of it all sat the Pharaoh. Not the man who had welcomed Amasis with honeyed words and poisoned hospitality, but something else entirely. His skin was parchment stretched over bone, his eyes empty sockets that nonetheless saw too much. In his hands he cradled a needle, its length impossibly long, its point glinting like a star. Ah, the Pharaoh said, his voice the rasp of sand against stone. You have come to join the stitching. Amasis tried to speak, to demand answers, but his tongue was heavy in his mouth, his words stolen before they could form. The Pharaoh smiled, his teeth sharp as a crocodile's. Do not struggle, it will only hurt more. He held up the needle, and Amasis saw that it was threaded not with gold or hair, but with something that pulsed faintly, like a vein pulled from a living thing. The sand at their feet stirred, the voices rising in a chorus of warning. und Wieland, Andelesses wird Ode könnte. Elias and Dinar. Missy dem Damen und dem Provisar. Fight go. Fight took telephone. And the Dame Paul. Eliasis. Lindsay Pumbishin. Work is read before it breaks you. Not as a Yelsonan, Nivon Behadis, is in this Sakan. Amasis stumbled back, but the hall had no exit. The walls pressed closer, the pillows shifting as if something inside them stirred. The Pharaoh stood, the needle gleaming in his skeletal grip. Every king must have his subjects, he murmured, and every bed must have its dreamers. He lunged. Amasis woke screaming, his body drenched in sweat, his fingers clawing at the sand beneath him. The pillow was gone. The wadi was gone. But the golden thread remained, now coiled around his wrist like a shackle. And from its twists, a single grain of black sand fell, humming softly as it struck the earth. Chapter 7. The Phantom Embrace. The desert nights had grown colder. Amasis sat huddled against a weathered outcrop of stone, the golden thread around his wrist pulsing faintly with every beat of his heart. It had wound itself tighter since the vision in the wadi, the fibers now embedded so deeply they seemed part of his flesh. He had tried to cut it free with a sharp edge of flint, but the blade passed through the thread as if it weren't there at all. And the sand. The black grains still fell, though he no longer carried the pillow. They trickled from the cuff of his sleeve, from his hair, from the corners of his eyes when he blinked. Each one hummed its mournful dirge before dissolving into the earth, leaving behind only the faintest stain, like ink in water. He was unraveling. He knew that now. Whatever curse the Pharaoh had sewn into him was working its way through his bones, stitch by invisible stitch. Exhaustion pressed down on him like a stone. He had not slept properly since the palace, and even then those brief moments of unconsciousness had been worse than wakefulness. But his body was failing. His thoughts blurred the edges, his limbs heavy, as if weighted with sand. Just a moment's rest. That was all he needed. Just to close his eyes, just until the moon reached its zenith. He slumped against the rock. The cold came first. Not the dry chill of the desert night, but something deeper, wetter, the kind of cold that lived in the depths of forgotten tombs. It seeped through his clothes, through his skin, settling in the hollows of his ribs. Then, the arms. Slender but unyielding, they slipped around his chest from behind, pressing against his back with the steady insistence of a lover who knew they would not be refused. Amasis tried to jerk away, but his body would not obey. His muscles had turned to stone, his breath trapped in his throat. Fingers, long and delicate, traced the line of his collarbone. A chin, sharp, bony, rested on his shoulder. "Shh," whispered a voice that was not a voice, but the sound of wind through a crypt's narrow passage. "You fight so hard, but you must be so tired." The grip tightened. Amasis could not see the figure that held him, but he could feel the press of bandages against his neck, the dry brush of linen where a cheek should have been. "Let go," the whisper urged. "Just for a little while. Let us carry you." The arms pulled him backward, or the world tilted forward, he could not tell which. The stone at his back vanished, replaced by something soft, something that gave beneath his weight like the most luxurious of beds. The pillow. It cradled him now, though he had not seen it appear. The golden embroidery shimmered in the moonlight, the hieroglyphs along its edges writhing like snakes. "Rest here, but never wake." "Heinde hun, hustet wieder her, Pama." "Aim." Amasis tried to scream, but the sound died in his chest. The arms around him shifted, one sliding up to cover his eyes, the other wrapping around his waist, pulling him down into the pillow's embrace. Darkness swallowed him, and the singing began. Not the humming of the black sand, but true singing, voices woven together in a lullaby older than the pyramids. They sang of the Nile's flood, of the weight of the sun, of the sweet, slow release of death. Amasis felt himself drifting, his limbs loosening, his thoughts unraveling like thread from a spool. It would be so easy to let go, to sink into the softness, to let the voices carry him away. Then, a flicker of warmth against his wrist. The golden thread was burning. Not metaphorically, not in the way it had before. Truly burning, the fibers blackening at the edges, the heat searing into his skin. The arms around him jerked in surprise. The singing faltered. Amasis gasped, the pain shocking him back into his body. He rolled sideways, tumbling off the pillow onto the hard, unforgiving ground. The arms were gone. The singing had stopped. But the pillow remained, its surface now marred by a single charred stitch where the golden thread had been. Amasis clutched his wrist to his chest, the smell of burnt linen thick in his nose. The thread still glowed faintly, the heat radiating through his flesh like a brand. It had saved him, or at the very least, it had fought against whatever lurked within the pillow. But as Amasis stared at the smoldering thread, a terrible thought occurred to him. What if the thread wasn't trying to save him at all? What if it was simply fighting to keep its claim? Overhead the stars watched, silent and indifferent. And somewhere in the dark, the Pharaoh laughed. Chapter 8. The Pharaoh's True Gift. The golden thread had stopped burning, but its mark remained. A raised, angry welt coiled around Amasis's wrist, like a serpent guarding its prize. The pillow lay a few paces away, innocuous in the moonlight, its embroidered edges still faintly smoking where the thread had scorched it. Amasis should have run. Every instinct told him to put as much distance between himself and that cursed thing as possible. But something held him in place. The servant's words echoed in his mind. I was the first to die, and with them came a terrible understanding. The Pharaoh had never been generous. The truth settled over him like a shroud. The feasts, the wine, the soft words, all of it had been bait. The pillow was no gift. It was a trap, a beautifully crafted snare designed to lure the weary and the desperate straight into the Pharaoh's grasp. But why? The answer came as the wind shifted, carrying with it a scent that did not belong in the desert. The cloying sweetness of embalming resins. The metallic tang of old blood. Amasis turned his head and saw her. The servant girl stood at the edge of the moonlight, her form flickering like a candle flame. No longer cloaked in linen, she wore the tattered remains of a palace servant's garb, the fabric stained and frayed. But it was her face that held Amasis's gaze, or rather, what was left of it. One side remained youthful, smooth. The other had collapsed inward, the skin sunken and gray as if something had hollowed her out from within. You see it now, she said, her voice barely more than a breath. What he takes from us. Amasis's mouth was dry. Your soul. The girl's lips twisted in something too bitter to be called a smile. Not just the soul, the weight of it, the warmth, the parts that laugh and weep and remember. She lifted a hand, and Amasis saw that her fingers were translucent, the bones beneath visible as though seen through cloudy water. He leaves just enough to serve, the rest goes into the stitching. A gust of wind rattled through the rocks, and for an instant Amasis heard it, the whisper of a needle pulling through cloth, over and over, an endless, rhythmic sound. The girl shuddered. Every soul he traps makes his own rest easier. Every life he steals pads his passage into the afterlife. Her gaze drifted to the pillow. And you are so close now. The thread has you. It's only a matter of time. Amasis looked down at the golden coil around his wrist. It had sunk deeper while he wasn't looking, the fibers now threaded through his veins in fine, glowing lines. How do I stop it? The servant girl's form flickered again, growing fainter. You can't, not while the Pharaoh draws breath. Her voice dropped to a whisper. But he's not the first to walk this path, and the ones who came before him, they remember what it is to be stolen. Before Amasis could ask what she meant, a sound cut through the night, the distant, mournful wail of a funerary horn. The girl's eyes widened. "He's coming." She vanished, her form dissolving into the wind like smoke. Amasis was alone again. But not for long. The horn sounded once more, closer now. The air grew thick with a scent of myrrh, and something darker, something that curled in the back of Amasis's throat like a living thing. The pillow stirred. Not much. Just a slight shift, as if something inside had turned over in its sleep. And from its seams, the black sand began to flow. Chapter 9. The Ritual of Unrest. The black sand pooled around the pillow like ink spreading through water, each grain vibrating with that same eerie hum. The sound built in Amasis' skull, pressing against his temples until his vision blurred at the edges. He tried to stand, to run, but his legs buckled beneath him, sending him crashing to his knees in the sand. The funerary horn wailed again, so close now it seemed to come from inside his own chest. Then the world tore open. One moment, Amasis knelt in the desert night. The next he stood in a vast torchlit chamber deep beneath the earth. The walls were lined with niches, each one holding a pillow, some pristine, others tattered and leaking black sand onto the floor. At the center of the chamber stood an altar carved from a single block of obsidian, its surface etched with hieroglyphs that squirmed under Amasis' gaze. And around it, the priests. Their bodies were wrapped in linen so old, it had yellowed to the color of old bone, their faces hidden behind masks of beaten gold. They moved in a slow, shuffling circle around the altar, their voices rising in a chant that was less sound than vibration. A thrumming that set Amasis' teeth on edge. On the altar lay a figure. Amasis could not tell if it was man or woman, alive or dead. Its body was wrapped in bandages, the strips of linen pulled taut enough to reveal the shape of the bones beneath. Only the face remained uncovered, the features slack, the eyes closed. As Amasis watched, one of the priests stepped forward, holding a needle nearly as long as his forearm. The thread attached to it glowed faintly, the same gold as the fibers embedded in Amasis' wrist. The chant rose to a crescendo as the priest plunged the needle into the figure's chest. There was no blood, no scream, only a sigh, soft as a breeze through dry reeds, as the thread pulled taut, stitching something invisible but vital into place. The figure on the altar spasmed. Its eyes flew open, the pupils wide and black, the whites veined with gold. Its mouth stretched in a silent scream as the priest continued to sew, the needle flashing in the torchlight as it dove in and out of the linen-wrapped flesh. With each stitch, the figure grew stiller, and the sand at the priest's feet grew louder. Amasis realized with dawning horror that the grains were singing, not the mournful hum he had heard before, but something sharper, something triumphant. The ritual was not just binding the figure to the altar. It was unraveling it. Thread by thread, breath by breath, the priests were pulling the life from the figure and weaving it into something else. Into the linen, into the pillows, into the Pharaoh's endless rest. A hand closed around Amasis' arm. He turned to find the servant girl beside him, her hollowed face tight with fear. "They are preparing a place for you," she whispered. "Can you feel it?" Amasis didn't need to ask what she meant. The golden thread in his wrist pulsed in time with the chanting, the fibers tightening with every breath. The priest with the needle turned. Though his face was hidden behind the gold mask, Amasis knew, somehow, with absolute certainty, that the man was looking straight at him. The chant shifted. A new word wove itself into the rhythm, a name spoken in a dozen voices at once. Amasis. The servant girl's grip tightened. "They see you." The priest raised the needle, and Amasis ran. The vision shattered around him, the chamber dissolving into sand and shadow. He found himself back in the desert, the pillow at his feet, a black sand now swirling around his ankles like water around a drowning man. The golden thread in his wrist burned white-hot, and from the darkness beyond the dunes, the funerary horn sounded once more. Closer this time. Much closer. Chapter 10. The Escape Plan. The horn's echo still trembled in the air when the servant girl materialized before Amasis, her translucent fingers clutching his shoulders. "Listen carefully," she hissed, her voice fraying at the edges like old linen. "There is one way to break the curse, but it must be done before dawn." Amasis' pulse throbbed where the golden thread burrowed deeper into his wrist. "How?" "You must return the pillow." The words left her lips like a death sentence. Not just cast it aside, it must be placed back in the Pharaoh's own chamber where it belongs. A cold laugh tore from Amasis' throat. "You expect me to walk back into that palace? After what I've seen?" The servant girl's grip tightened, her nails biting into his skin despite their ghostly form. "Do you think the alternative is better? To let them stitch you into that cursed thing?" Her hollowed eyes flickered toward the horizon, where the first faint tinge of gray hinted at approaching dawn. "The priests are already coming. When they find you, they won't ask nicely." As if summoned, the horn sounded again, closer now. The sand beneath Amasis' feet shifted, grains vibrating with that same unnatural hum. The servant girl released him and stepped back, her form flickering like a guttering candle. "There is a way inside, a passage beneath the eastern wall, hidden by a carving of Anubis. The guards never watch it. They think it's sealed." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "But you must go now, and you must not stop. Not for anything." Amasis swallowed hard. The thought of turning back toward that golden nightmare of a palace made his stomach twist, but the memory of the ritual chamber, of the needle flashing in the torchlight, was worse. He bent and snatched up the pillow. The moment his fingers touched the linen, the world lurched. The desert vanished, replaced by a vision of the palace's great hall, the pharaoh seated upon his throne, his skeletal fingers steepled beneath his chin, his empty eye sockets fixed on a point just beyond Amasis, his lipless mouth curling in a smile. "He is coming," the pharaoh murmured, the words slithering through the air like serpents. "Bring the needle." The vision shattered. Amasis staggered, the pillow clutched tight against his chest. The servant girl was gone, but her warning lingered like the taste of copper on his tongue. "Go now. And do not stop." The dunes blurred beneath his feet as he ran, the pillow radiating a terrible warmth against his skin. With every step, the golden thread in his wrist pulsed, sending jolts of pain up his arm. He could feel it, the connection between himself and the palace, a tether pulling tighter with each passing moment. The eastern wall rose from the darkness, like the edge of the world, its stones worn smooth by centuries of wind. Amasis scanned the carvings, his breath coming in ragged gasps. There, near the base, half buried in sand, the jackal-headed visage of Anubis stared back at him, its stone eyes gleaming faintly in the moonlight. Amasis dropped to his knees and pressed his palm against the carving. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, with a groan of ancient stone, the wall shifted. A narrow crack appeared, just wide enough for a man to slip through sideways. The smell that wafted from the opening was not the dry scent of buried stone, but something far worse. The cloying sweetness of embalming oils, the metallic tang of old blood. Somewhere behind him, the sand began to sing. Amasis didn't hesitate. He squeezed through the gap, the pillow clutched tight against his chest, the golden thread in his wrist burning like a brand. The passage beyond was tight and dark, the walls pressing close enough to scrape his shoulders. The air grew thicker with each step, the scent of myrrh so strong it coated his tongue. Then, faint at first but growing clearer, the sound of chanting. The priests were waiting, and dawn was coming. Chapter 11. The Guardian Scarabs. The chanting grew louder as Amasis pressed deeper into the passage, the sound vibrating through the stone walls like the hum of 1,000 wasps. The pillow in his arms had grown heavier, its golden embroidery now glowing faintly in the darkness, pulsing in time with the thread embedded in his wrist. Every step sent fresh waves of pain radiating up his arm, as if the fibers were slowly stitching themselves through his veins. Then he saw them. At first they looked like nothing more than shadows pooling along the base of the walls. Then the shadows shifted, resolving into shapes. Dozens of them. Maybe hundreds. Scarabs. But not the dull, dirt-colored beetles that scuttled through the desert. These were wrought from gold, their carapaces gleaming even in the dim light, their legs moving with unnatural precision. As Amasis watched, frozen, the scarabs began to arrange themselves in a perfect line across the passage, blocking his path. Their shells were not smooth, but etched with tiny markings. Hieroglyphics. And Pedimsile, the merchant, the scholar, the dancer. Every soul the Pharaoh had taken. The largest scarab, its shell inlaid with lapis lazuli, clattered its wings. The sound was like dry bones rattling in a ceramic jar. Then, as one, the swarm turned toward Amasis, their antennae twitching, their mandibles clicking in unison. A voice, if it could be called a voice, whispered from the swarm. It was the sound of wind through a crypt, of sand sliding over a long-sealed tomb. Turn back. Hades. Amasis' breath caught in his throat. He could feel the weight of the pillow in his arms, the way it seemed to press against his chest as if trying to burrow inside. The golden thread in his wrist burned hotter, the pain sharp enough to make his vision swim. The scarabs advanced, their golden legs ticking against the stone like the hands of a dozen clocks, all counting down to the same terrible moment. Amasis took a step back. Then, another. The largest scarab reared up, its wings flaring. The name on its back was older than the others, the hieroglyphs worn nearly smooth. He was the first. The servant girl. Amasis' stomach twisted. He had no weapon, no way to fight. The passage was too narrow to maneuver, the walls pressing in on either side. Even if he tried to run, the scarabs would overtake him in seconds. Then the pillow moved. Not much. Just a faint twitch, as if something inside had stirred in its sleep. The scarabs froze. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the largest scarab, the one bearing the servant girl's name, turned its head. Not toward Amasis, but toward the pillow. Its antennae quivered. A sound like a sigh rushed through the swarm, the scarabs shifting uneasily, their golden shells clinking together like coins in a beggar's bowl. She remembers, the whisper came again, softer now. She remembers, and she is angry. Valentine. Amasis didn't wait to see what happened next. He lunged forward, kicking through the line of scarabs, his sandals connecting with golden carapaces that gave way like brittle parchment. The beetles scattered, their clicking rising to a frenzied pitch, but they did not regroup. They did not pursue. The largest scarab watched him pass, its antennae drooping. Hurry. It whispered, before the priests finished the chant. Amasis ran, took. The passage twisted downward, the air growing thicker, the scent of myrrh so strong it burned his eyes. The chanting was deafening now, the voices layered atop one another in a rising crescendo. And beneath it all, the steady, rhythmic sound of a needle pulling through cloth. Stitch. Stitch. Gently. Stitch. The golden thread in Amasis' wrist pulsed in time. Somewhere ahead, a door loomed in the darkness. And dawn was coming. Chapter 12. The Bargain with Anubis. The door loomed before Amasis, its surface carved with the shapes of sleeping figures, their faces contorted in silent screams. The chanting from beyond had reached a fever pitch. The voices no longer human, but something older, something that slithered between words and howls. The pillow in his arms had grown hotter, its golden threads pulsing like veins, the hieroglyphs along its edges writhing as if trying to rearrange themselves into some new, terrible warning. Amasis pressed his palm against the door. The moment his skin touched the wood, the world dissolved. He stood in a vast, starless void, the air thick with the scent of natron and decay. Before him rose a figure, taller than any man, his jackal head tilted in silent contemplation, his golden eyes reflecting no light yet seeing everything. Anubis Deliverance. The god did not speak. He did not need to. The weight of his gaze pressed against Amasis's skin like a physical thing, peeling back layers of flesh and bone until only the barest essence of him remained, a flickering, fragile thing clutched in those skeletal fingers. Amasis fell to his knees. "Please." The word tore from his throat, raw and ragged. "I don't want to die." Anubis tilted his head the other way, his ears twitching. When he finally spoke, his voice was the sound of sand pouring into an open grave. "Kal main disorders die, main decorster." Even kings. "Khalif?" "Not like this," Amasis gasped. The golden thread in his wrist had begun to unravel, the fibers stretching toward Anubis like roots seeking water. "Not stitched into that cursed thing." The god's fingers tightened around the flickering light that was Amasis's soul. "What will you give?" "Istalar, indos mobility." Amasis had no jewels, no land, no treasures to offer. All he had were memories, the taste of his mother's bread hot from the oven, the sound of his sister's laughter, the way the Nile had glittered at dawn when he was a boy, and the world had seemed endless. He closed his eyes. "Take one, Residendais." Anubis went very still. "Which?" "Ejanesin deban, and ekanontesin." "The happiest," Amasis whispered. "The day my father taught me to fish, the way the sun felt on my shoulders, the way he smiled when I caught my first tilapia." Even as he spoke, the memory began to fade, the colors leaching away like dye in water. Anubis exhaled, his breath the dry rasp of papyrus unrolling. "Trimau, fair trade. Pedamanis." The god's fingers uncurled. Where Amasis's happiest memory had been, there was now only a faint warmth, like the last ember of a dying fire. But the golden thread in his wrist had gone dark, the fibers crumbling to ash. The pillow in his arms gave one last, shuddering twitch, then fell still. The void shattered. Amasis gasped as he was flung back into his body, his knees hitting the stone floor of the passage with a crack that sent pain shooting up his thighs. The door before him swung open on silent hinges, revealing the chamber beyond. The priests stood in a circle, their chanting faltering as they turned toward him. At their center lay the Pharaoh upon the obsidian altar, his skeletal hands folded over his chest, his empty eye sockets fixed on the ceiling. And beside him, glinting in the torchlight, lay a needle threaded with gold. The pillow in Amasis's arms was no longer warm, no longer moving. But the dawn was coming, and the Pharaoh was waiting. Chapter 13. The sands of time reverse. The moment the pillow stilled in Amasis's arms, the black sand scattered across the chamber floor began to tremble. Not the faint hum of before, but something deeper, something that made the stone beneath his feet vibrate like the skin of a drum. The priests' chanting faltered. One by one they turned from their circle, their golden masks reflecting the torchlight in jagged streaks. The needle beside the Pharaoh twitched, its golden thread unraveling strand by strand into the air like smoke. Then the sand began to move. Not forward, not in its usual slow, inevitable trickle. Backward. Each grain lifted from the floor, suspended for a heartbeat in the thick air, before streaking back toward the pillow in Amasis's hands. They moved with impossible precision, threading themselves through the fabric seams, reversing their centuries-long escape. The whispering voices that had haunted Amasis since the first night rose in a chorus. Not mournful now, but furious, the sound of 1,000 wronged souls howling for justice. The pharaoh's skeletal hands clenched on the altar. Amasis didn't wait. He lunged forward, the pillow held out before him like an offering, or a weapon. The nearest priest reached for him, linen-wrapped fingers brushing his arm. But the moment they made contact, the priest's form shuddered. His golden mask cracked down the center, revealing not flesh beneath, but more bandages yellowed and brittle with age. The pillow grew heavier with every step, the returning sand filling it beyond what should have been possible. The fabric strained, the golden embroidery darkening as the threads absorbed the fleeing grains. The pharaoh sat up. His lipless mouth opened, but no sound came out, only a stream of black sand, pouring forth like water from a shattered jar. His bandages began to unravel, not from the ends, but from the middle, the strips peeling back to reveal hollow spaces where organs should have been. Spaces now filling with rushing sand, flowing the wrong way up his arms, his throat, his empty eye sockets. Amasis reached the altar. For a heartbeat, he and the pharaoh locked gazes, one living, one not, both caught in the same terrible current. Then Amasis placed the pillow in the pharaoh's lap. The effect was instantaneous. The remaining sand in the chamber surged toward it, a black river flowing upstream. The priests staggered, their forms collapsing inward like empty sacks as the sand that had filled them for centuries rushed back to its source. The needle on the altar snapped, its thread dissolving into dust. The pharaoh's mouth stretched wide in a silent scream as the sand poured into him, through him the hollow spaces where stolen lives had once rested. His bandages whipped in an unfelt wind, the strips coiling tighter and tighter around his body, until with a final shuddering gasp he stilled. A perfect mummy once more. The pillow in his lap was now plain linen, its golden threads faded to dull brown, its seams still but no longer straining. Somewhere beyond the chamber walls, a cock crowed. Dawn had come. Amasis took a step back, his body trembling with exhaustion. The golden thread in his wrist was gone, leaving only a pale scar in its place. The whispers had fallen silent. Even the torchlight seemed dimmer, as if whatever unnatural energy had sustained it had finally burned out. He turned toward the door, toward the passage that led back to the desert, back to the world of the living. Behind him, the pharaoh's remains crumbled to dust, the pillow tumbling to the floor with a soft, final sigh. And in the silence that followed, Amasis could have sworn he heard one last whisper, not angry, not mournful, but relieved. Kan hank you? Kan not kan? Istedliye de sumudeli bundekufie. Eskandalen Sunday. Then even that was gone. The sands had settled. The curse was broken. And somewhere beyond the palace walls, the sun rose on a new day. Chapter 14. The Pharaoh's Wrath. The dawn light filtering through the palace corridors should have brought relief. But as Amasis stumbled through the empty halls, his shadow stretching long before him, the air grew heavier with each step. The walls seemed to breathe, the painted figures along them twisting their heads to track his progress. A whisper of dry linen stirred behind him. Then another. Amasis glanced back. The corridor lay empty, the early morning sunlight pooling on the stone floor. Yet the whispering grew louder, not voices now, but the soft, relentless rustle of bandages unwinding. He broke into a run. The scar along his wrist, where the golden thread had once been, burned suddenly white-hot. A hiss escaped his teeth as he clutched it to his chest. The pain was a warning, a remnant of the connection not fully severed. The pharaoh might have crumbled to dust, but his will lingered in these walls. A shadow detached itself from a doorway ahead. Tall and impossibly thin, its edges blurred like ink in water. The figure stood motionless, its featureless face turned toward Amasis. Then another shadow peeled away from the opposite wall. And another. They did not move to block his path, only watched, their presence thickening the air with the scent of myrrh and stale breath. The whispers resolved into words. Anubis took what was given. Unmende and Anubis, Iltosidikaskeha, Untund Satan Tabtabokabe. Nibeli stage. None refused the gift. Enstasio. None escaped the dream. Amasis veered down a side passage, his sandals slapping against stone. The shadows did not follow. They didn't need to. He could feel them waiting ahead, gathering in the unseen corners of the palace, their whispers weaving a net he could not yet see. A cool draft brushed the back of his neck. Amasis spun, nearly colliding with the servant girl. Her form flickered, less substantial than before, her hollowed cheek translucent in the pale light. He is not gone, she breathed. Only waiting. The scarab, Bart. The name on its back. You, Amasis gasped. You were the first. The girl's lips parted, but before she could speak, the shadows at the end of the corridor surged forward. Not shadows anymore. Figures. Wrapped in linen so ancient it had blackened with time, their faces blank voids beneath their wrappings, they moved with the awful certainty of something that had all of eternity to reclaim what was lost. The whisper of their bandages filled the hole, a sound like 1,000 snakes sliding over stone. The servant girl's hand closed around Amasis's wrist, the scarred one, her fingers icy. "Run," she pleaded, "while you still can." Then she turned toward the advancing figures, her form solidifying, her hollowed face hardening into something fierce. The first shadow guard reached for her. Her hand snapped up, gripping its wrist. Where her fingers touched, the ancient linen blackened further, then crumbled like charred paper. The guard shuddered, its form collapsing inward, bandages hissing as they unraveled into dust. Amasis didn't wait. He ran. Behind him, the servant girl stood her ground, her laughter ringing through the halls, bright and sharp and alive, in a way nothing in this cursed palace had been for centuries. The scarab had remembered, and she was angry. Amasis burst into the courtyard, the rising sun blinding after the gloom of the palace. The gates stood open, the desert beyond shimmering with heat. He did not look back, but as he crossed the threshold, a final whisper chased him, trembling with fury. "She will dream of us. And we will be waiting." Then the gates slammed shut behind him with a sound like a tomb ceiling. The desert air burned his lungs. The sun seared his skin, and Amasis ran and did not stop. Chapter 15. The Dawn of Deliverance. The Nile glittered before Amasis like a ribbon of molten gold, its waters sluggish with the morning heat. His chest burned, his legs trembling from the miles he had run without pause, his sandals long since torn to shreds on the unforgiving stones of the desert. But none of that mattered now. The pillow lay heavy in his arms, no longer humming, no longer warm, but still pulsing faintly with the life it should not have possessed. The golden embroidery had dulled to the color of old blood, the hieroglyphs along its edges now illegible, not through wear, but as though something had deliberately scraped them away. Amasis waded into the shallows, the cool water a shock against his sun-blistered skin. The current tugged at his ankles, whispering secrets in a language he almost understood. He hesitated. For all the terror, for all the sleepless nights and the phantom hands that had tried to drag him into the dark, there was a part of him that wondered, what if he kept it? What if he turned back now, found some hidden corner of the world where the Pharaoh's reach could not extend, and held on to this cursed thing, this last remnant of power he had wrenched from the dead king's grasp? Then the scar on his wrist flared, a white-hot brand against his flesh. The choice was not his to make. Amasis drew back his arms and hurled the pillow into the Nile. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The pillow bobbed lazily on the surface, the water darkening the linen, dragging it slowly under. Then the river erupted. Not in spray, not in foam, but in a great heaving swell, as though something vast had stirred beneath the surface. The water turned black, then red, then a green so vivid it hurt to look upon. The pillow twisted in the current, the seams bursting open, the last of the black sand pouring forth in a cloud that spread through the water like ink. The sand did not dissolve. It moved against the current, swirling, coalescing, forming shapes that might have been faces, might have been hands, might have been the shadows of things best left unseen. The river shuddered, the very banks trembling as the water pulled itself apart and then together again, the sand spinning tighter until... The Nile flowed on, placid once more, the pillow gone. A breeze stirred the reeds along the shore, carrying with it the scent of lotus blossoms and, faintly, the memory of embalming spices. Amasis stood frozen, the water lapping at his knees, his breath coming in ragged gasps. It was over. It had to be over. The curse was broken, the Pharaoh's hold undone. The scar on his wrist had faded to a pale, thin line, no longer burning. Then the breeze died, and a whisper brushed against his ear, so soft he might have imagined it. Can you? Canon. Amasis turned, but there was no one there. Only the river and the rising sun, and the endless empty sky. He stepped back onto the shore, his legs giving way beneath him as the exhaustion of days, of sleepless nights, of horrors endured crashed down at last. The sand was warm beneath his palms, the grains ordinary now, just sand, nothing more. Somewhere downstream, a fish broke the surface of the Nile, the ripples spreading wide before vanishing into the current. Amasis lay back, his eyes drifting shut. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he slept. And if he dreamed, there were no whispers, no golden threads, no hands reaching for him from the dark. Only the river, and the wind, and the distant, fading echo of something that might have been laughter. Or, perhaps, just the sigh of the world settling back into place. Chapter 16. The Lesson in Trust. The morning sun had climbed high by the time Amasis woke, his body stiff from sleeping on the riverbank, his skin tender where the desert sun had scorched him. For one blissful moment he lay still, listening to the lap of the Nile against the shore, the distant calls of water birds, the rustle of reeds in the breeze. Then memory returned. The palace, the sand, the whispers, and his hand flew to his wrist. The scar was still there, but it no longer burned. It was just a scar now, thin and pale. A reminder of a lesson learned the hard way. Amasis sat up slowly, his muscles protesting, his stomach growling with a hunger that had been buried beneath fear for too long. The river stretched before him, placid and blue, giving no hint of the darkness it had swallowed the night before. He splashed water on his face, the coolness of balm against his sunburned skin, and tried not to think about what might have happened if he had kept the pillow. If he had given in to that fleeting, treacherous thought, what if I held on to just a little of its power? A heron stalked through the shallows nearby, its sharp eyes fixed on the water, its patience endless. Amasis watched as it struck, swift and sure, emerging with a fish writhing in its beak. The lesson was clear enough. Some gifts came with hooks. His reflection in the water looked older than he remembered, his eyes shadowed, his mouth set in a line that had not been there before. But he was alive. That was more than the merchant, the scholar, the dancer could say. More than the servant girl, if she had ever truly been alive at all. A breeze stirred the hair at his nape, carrying with it the scent of baking bread from some nearby village. Amasis turned his face toward it, his stomach clenching. Food, God. Shelter, plenty. Shelter, a place to rest that was not haunted by the ghosts of pharaohs. These were things he could trust. He stood, brushing the sand from his tattered clothes, and took one last look at the river. The water gave nothing back. Whatever secrets it held, it would keep them. As Amasis turned his back on the Nile and began walking toward the scent of bread, he made himself a promise: no more gifts from kings. No more soft words from smiling mouths. No more pillows, no matter how luxurious, no matter how sweet the promises that came with them. The world was full of traps for the weary and the trusting. But he would sleep on the ground from now on. And if he ever found himself standing before another golden palace, another grinning ruler, with another too generous offer, he would run. The heron took flight as he passed, its wings beating against the morning sky. Amasis kept walking, his shadow stretching long before him, his steps steady, his heart light. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was his, and that was gift enough. Chapter 17. The pillow's last whisper. The fire had burned low, leaving only embers to glow against the gathering dark. Amasis stretched his legs toward the warmth, the scent of roasted fish still clinging to his fingers. The village behind him slept, its mud brick houses silent, its dogs curled in the dust. A good place, this. Far enough from the river to avoid floods, near enough to trade for salt and spices. He had been here a month, maybe two. Long enough to mend his clothes, to let his blisters heal, to forget, almost, the feel of golden thread beneath his skin. A night bird called from the acacia tree overhead, its cry sharp and sudden. Amasis tilted his head back to look, but the branches were thick with shadows. Then the wind shifted, not the usual desert breeze, carrying sand and the dry scent of scrub. This was something else, a breath of air too cold for the season, too still, smelling of myrrh and old stone. Amasis went very still. The scar on his wrist, long since faded to a pale line, gave a single warning throb. He held his breath. The embers cracked, sending up a spiral of sparks. And beneath the sound, so quiet he might have imagined it, came a whisper. "You were the one who got away." "Why they are not lazy?" The voice was unmistakable. Dry as papyrus, smooth as oil, the words curling at the edges like burned linen. Amasis did not move, did not speak. His pulse hammered in his throat, but his hands remained steady where they rested on his knees. The wind died. The embers dimmed. The night bird called again, closer now, its wings rustling among the leaves. Amasis let out his breath. When he slept that night, it was with his back to a sturdy wall, his knife close at hand, and his bedroll thin enough that no hidden thing could hide within its folds. And if, in the deepest hour of the night, the shadows at the edge of the firelight stirred, just once, just slightly, well, some lessons only needed learning once. The dawn came as it always did. Amasis rose, rolled his blanket, and walked on. Behind him, the acacia tree stood empty, its branches bare of birds. And somewhere, perhaps in the wind, perhaps in the sigh of the sand, a king's laughter faded into silence. The road stretched ahead, long and dusty and blessedly ordinary. Amasis smiled and followed it.